Hello, and welcome to the second of 3 lectures in the process capacity section of the course. This time around, we're going to talk about waiting line systems. We're going to begin by talking about the essential features of waiting lines or queuing systems. And by the way, I'll use the terms waiting line or queue interchangeably throughout this lecture. What I mean by essential features are variability in arrivals and variability in service times, as well as how work flows through the system. The variability that you find in waiting line systems leads to the buildup of queues over time, even when it seems like there's plenty of capacity, and that's why it's of particular interest to understanding process capacity. Once we've done a general description of waiting line systems, then we're going to use some applied statistics to understand how arrival and service processes impact the performance of the waiting line. We'll show how changes to the arrival rate and service rate can impact the performance of a queue. After that, we'll talk about the economics and psychology of waiting, which is of particular interest in service environments where you have people as the element waiting in the queue. And that brings up a point I want to make. When we talk about waiting line theory and waiting line systems, who is in the queue can vary from one situation to the next. It could be people queuing up, it could be products, electronic messages, forms to be filled out, whatever. Regardless, the same basic analytical statistical principles apply. We're going to start with some simple analysis, some very simple waiting line environments, and work up to more complex and realistic examples. In fact, the most complex waiting line systems typically have to be evaluated using simulation models. Okay, so queuing systems or waiting line systems. The first point I want to make is that queuing systems are found in nearly every business. Unless you can absolutely control the pace of arrivals and control the pace of work in a system, you're going to have queues build up. Let me give you an example. Imagine this situation. You have a manufacturing plant where the time it takes to process an item is exactly 1 minute. So from the time the item arrives to the time it's finished and goes out of the process is 1 minute. So you have a constant service time. Now suppose also you have items coming into the system every minute. You have a constant arrival time. So if you have arrivals coming in at a constant rate of 1 per minute and the service time is 1 per minute, then you never expect a queue to build up of work. As soon as you get done with one unit, the next one arrives, and so on. So in that particular case, we don't have to worry about these waiting lines or queues building up. However, most business situations aren't like that. Even many manufacturing environments don't have that kind of control over the service times or the arrival rate of materials. The problem is even bigger for services. Imagine a hospital or a restaurant. You may try to control when people arrive, but you can't manage it to such a point that a customer arrives at the emergency room every 5 minutes. Tick, 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 tick. It's just not going to happen. Furthermore, as we discussed in earlier lectures, the bundle of services that individuals require can change drastically from one person to the next. So not only do the arrivals vary, but the required service times vary. The third problem that services have is that since the customer is there, they experience the waiting line firsthand. Many of you have a cell phone. The parts that went into your cell phone probably had to wait at different workstations before they were put together, but they weren't angry about it. They didn't complain. I mean, they're inanimate objects. However, you put a person in the line, and after 5 minutes, they're going to start getting upset. So in service environments, we really have to worry about how waiting line systems perform. So what are the essential features of a queuing system? The reason I'm going to go through this is because once we understand the essential features of a queuing system, we can start thinking about how we model these and either use applied statistics or simulation model to evaluate their performance. A point I want to make about arrival rates is that they can be static or they can change over time. Let me give you an example. Take a McDonald's. The arrival rate during a peak hour might be, 200 cars an hour. The arrival rate during a non-peak time might just be 50 cars per hour. So not only is the time between arrivals random, but the arrival rates themselves can be dynamic. It's best to illustrate this. Here is an example of random times between arrivals, and this is for a health clinic. And notice what they're measuring here is patient inter-arrival times. So literally the x-axis of the graph is measuring the time between the arrivals of patients. So if one patient comes in and 5 minutes later the next patient comes in, it's going to fit in somewhere here. So what do you notice here? There's clearly randomness in the time between arrivals. In the vast majority, about 30% of the cases, a little over 30% of the cases, there's less than a minute between arrivals. About 25% of the time, there's about 2 minutes between arrivals, and so on. Very rarely you might have 7, 8, 9, or even as many as 15 minutes between arrivals. But here we are seeing an example of randomness in the arrivals, what we call inter-arrival time, time between the arrivals. Now that's different than seeing dynamic arrival rates. What arrival rates say is what's the number of arrivals coming in per period of time. So what you see right here in this particular case is at about the 6th hour of the day for this particular process here, they get about, it looks about to be about half a call per hour. Now, we're not looking right now at the time between arrivals, we're looking at the number of calls per hour. And we get a peak up there at a little under 3.5 at around the 17th hour of the day. So not only is the time between arrivals of calls random, but the number of calls you get per period of time can change. So we have randomness and dynamic arrivals. Another way to look at this, maybe this one might be a little bit clearer, is the number of calls they get varies based on the day of the week. Let's say on Monday they get most of their calls. Or this is the percentage of average daily physician visits. They get most of their calls or visits on Monday, followed by Tuesday, and so on. So it looks like people are kind of saving up their visits to the doctor over the weekend and all coming in on Monday. And I guess more people are coming in on Friday anticipating that the office is going to be closed on Saturday and Sunday. But nonetheless, the arrival rate changes. Okay, so think about that for a second. We've got both randomness, that is variability in the time between arrivals, and the arrival rate itself may vary over time. It may be dynamic. Now, if we look at the actual queue configuration, which describes how units flow through the system, we could have single versus multiple lines. We could have a situation where we assume that we have infinite capacity to handle whoever comes into the system, or finite capacity. Now, what I mean by capacity in this particular case is, let's say I have a doctor's office and I have enough seating there for 100 people. Well, if the arrival rates are reasonable, it's not likely I'm going to fill up every chair there. On the other hand, I could have a situation like a drive-through window where I only have enough room for 3 cars. So I have finite capacity, in which case either a car driving up will balk, it won't enter the line, or they could even abandon it once they're in the line. So if I have finite capacity in the queue configuration, I can actually block units from entering the process. Most of the models that we'll look at assume there's infinite capacity to hold units in the system, but that doesn't mean we necessarily serve them fast. It just means we have room to hold on to them. And so again, we have the arrivals coming into the queue configuration. In some cases, units may balk, decide not to enter the queue. In other cases, they may abandon the queue once they've been in there for a while. And if you've ever been on a telephone call where you've been on hold for 5 minutes and hung up, you abandoned the queue. And these are just some examples of queue configurations. Here we have multiple queues here. We have one line here, one line there, one line there, one line there. And units are thrown into one queue based on some kind of sorting logic. An alternative approach to this is, while I have 4 servers here, and the servers are shown by the boxes, those are actual capacity elements capable of doing work. In the single queue, here I have 4 servers as well, but I have a single line that feeds the 4. So when a unit's turn comes up, it goes to the first available service unit. This is like what you see in a bank. And here's another example of how we might configure the queue. We may not even have the individuals stand in line like this, but they simply take a number, or they're called up to the desk based on when they checked in. So these are just some simple examples of queue configurations. We'll talk about some other ones more specifically later on in this lecture. So again, we have the arrival process, we have the queue configuration. Now we have something called queue discipline. And this means what is the rule that we as a business use for selecting the next item to serve? Nearly all the analytical models assume that units are handled on a first come, first served basis, and that's what we'll look at here. But in a lot of actual business situations, the queue discipline is a little more subtle. For instance, in manufacturing, it's very common when there's a number of manufacturing jobs waiting on a resource to take the one with the shortest processing time first. The idea being, if I take a job that needs only 2 hours to be completed versus a job that takes 5 hours, I can get that 2-hour job downstream to the next process step. There's other priority rules in manufacturing, uses such as earliest due date, etc., etc. But for purposes of this lecture, we're going to assume that the queuing discipline is a first come, first serve. And finally, we got the service process itself. So not only do we have a random arrivals coming in with random time between arrivals and dynamic arrival rates, but the actual service times themselves can vary. And how these times vary can differ from one business situation to the next. I'll just tell you for purposes of this lecture, we're going to assume that service times do vary and they follow a particular probability distribution. Now, is that always the case? Certainly not. In some manufacturing situations, the service time is constant, or for all practical purposes, constant. In other cases, the service time could be either very short or very long. For instance, imagine people in line at a bank. Some people just need to deposit a check. Other people need to do a lot of complex transactions. So the service time may go from anywhere from like a minute to 5 or 6 minutes. But there's a lot of ways to analyze that. But my point is, if we start thinking about all these essential features of a queuing system, we see a lot of variability, randomness, complexity there. And we want to be able to pull that apart for our analyses. Okay, this is just an example of variability in the service times. So again, we have another diagram here where they tracked the number of minutes it took to handle a patient at a outpatient clinic. So about 2.5% of the time it took less than a minute. Maybe this is just getting a prescription refilled or checking an appointment or something. On average, though, it seems like it's taking about 8 or 9 minutes to handle the patient. In some cases, it took almost half an hour to handle the patient. So that's kind of unusual for this outpatient clinic. Now, this is for the walk-in service. If we look at the appointment service, then what we see is, again, there's variability in the service times, but they're stretched out a little bit longer on average, which is what you would expect. I mean, rarely would you have an appointment service where it took only a couple minutes, but indeed it happened in this case. More likely it's going to take, it looks to be around, I don't know, about 11 minutes on average to handle a patient via the appointment service process. Okay, so if you wanted to take a little bit of time and look at the different histograms I've given you here, just so you kind of can get an appreciation for the variability in arrival times between arrivals, arrival rates, and service times. And here's a third one right here. Okay, so that's just a little bit of background on the essential features of waiting line or queuing systems. Now the good thing for us is that experts have been looking at these types of systems for a long time, and they've developed some formulas that we can use to answer some basic questions about a queuing system. For instance, given a certain arrival rate, and what is the expected time between customer arrivals? On average, how many jobs will be in the queue given a certain arrival rate, a queue configuration, and a certain service rate? How long will callers wait on average? What impact will adding more resources have on queue performance? And this is the one I really want to emphasize. If we have a queue and we're thinking about adding resources to it to quote unquote improve performance to the customer, what do we think the impact is going to be? We just can't guess. So in this section, we're going to apply some of these formulas that have been developed via applied statistics using a spreadsheet containing several worksheets. And that's the queuing systems.xls spreadsheet that's posted to the web. Okay, let's go back and talk a little bit more about arrival rates. And I'm going to move from a kind of a general description of arrival rates to using a specific probability distribution to model them. Let's say you hear someone mention, quote, we get about 5 calls during the lunch hour. What that really means then is that the arrival rate is 5 arrivals per hour, and that the average time between arrivals therefore is 60 minutes divided by those 5 arrivals per hour, or 12 minutes. So I want to emphasize right now the difference between arrival rate and time between arrivals. And the interesting thing is, as we've talked about already, both the arrival rate and the inter-arrival times can vary. Again, thinking through this mental exercise here, let's say we test what the person said. So on day 1, we start looking at arrivals between noon and 1 p.m. At 12:08, we get our first arrival. 20 minutes goes by and we get our second arrival. 5 minutes goes by and we get our third arrival, and 19 minutes goes by before we get the fourth arrival at 12:52. And then no one else arrives between noon and 1 p.m. So for this particular day, we had 4 arrivals. Furthermore, the average inter-arrival time was 14.7 minutes. Now we check out the next day. In this particular case, we actually have 6 arrivals between noon and 1 p.m. One at 12:03, 12:20, 12:28, 12:40, 12:49, 12:54. So we have 6 arrivals this day, and the average, the in-arrival times are 17 minutes. You can see the gap there. 8 minutes, 12, 9, 5. So an average in-arrival time of 11 minutes. So you notice the more arrivals you have per time period, the shorter on average are the inter-arrival times. So if we calculate across the 2 days, the average number of arrivals was 5, and the average inter-arrival time was 12 minutes. So I'm just trying to emphasize the relationship between arrival rates and inter-arrival times. And this is, you can start to see a little bit of the variability here and why it could be problematic. Okay. Now that said, there's actually a formula for estimating the probability of n arrivals, and it requires us to make some assumptions. Before we get into a nasty formula, I want to go back and look at one of the histograms we showed earlier, where we mapped out patient inter-arrival times at the clinic. If we look at this, one of the things you'll notice is that when we're talking about inter-arrival times, we can never have an inter-arrival time less than 0. Furthermore, the inter-arrival times are constant, so they get spread out. With the further you go out into larger inter-arrival times, less likely there is that that event will occur. Now, this depends obviously on what the average inter-arrival time is for the system. So we have something that looks like this. And we guess, if I'm looking at here, that the average inter-arrival time is something around 3 minutes. Now let's say the average inter-arrival time was something like 6 minutes. If we were to develop the same histogram, we might expect it to look something more like this. Or if the average inter-arrival time was 10 minutes, maybe it might look something like that. Now, when we're talking about inter-arrival times, I'm going to write it here, Inter-arrival times follow what's called a negative exponential distribution. And just like you've always heard folks talk about the normal distribution, people's heights and weights follow a normal distribution. Well, the time between arrivals follows a negative exponential distribution. Now, there is a relationship between inter-arrival times and arrival rates. While the inter-arrival times follow a negative exponential distribution, which is a constant distribution, the actual arrival rates follow what's called a Poisson distribution. Now, I want to think about this one for just a second. Think about arrival rates. Can I have 0 arrivals over a period of time? I could. It may not be very likely, but I could. It all depends on the underlying population. Could I have 1 arrival, or 2 arrivals, or 3? Yes. Let me ask you this. Can I have, over a period of time, 3.5 arrivals? Can I have 3.5 arrivals? If you think about it, no. Either a unit arrives or it doesn't. The Poisson distribution is what we call a discrete probability distribution, since you can only have whole number results. In contrast, the negative exponential distribution is a continuous distribution because the time between arrivals obviously doesn't have to fall on a single whole number. So the next formula we're going to look at estimates the probability of n arrivals given a certain arrival rate. So this is a formula based on the Poisson distribution. And the way it works is as follows. We want to use this formula to calculate the probability of having exactly n arrivals in t time periods given that the average arrival rate is some number lambda. So basically what we do is we'd figure out what lambda is, we'd stick it into the formula. Maybe it's 5 arrivals per hour. If we're looking at the number of arrivals in 1 hour, we'd have t of 1. If it's 2 hours, we'd have 2, etc. And maybe we're interested in calculating the probability of 4 arrivals, in which case our n would be 4. And we churn through the math. Now again, you look at a formula like this and say, where the heck did this come from? We don't have to worry about it. Statisticians have developed it. It's a proven formula. It assumes that if the arrival rates follow a Poisson distribution, which is what we're going to assume here, we can calculate the probability of n arrivals given this formula. And by the way, this formula is embedded in the worksheet called arrivals. So let's show how we might use this. Let's say Donna manages a call center, and records show that the average arrival rate is 5 calls per hour, but the actual number can vary. The actual arrival rate that occurs during a particular time period could vary. So again, since we're talking about arrival rates, it's got to be a whole number of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then we're going to assume the arrival rate is Poisson distributed. And Donna wants to know the following. What's the probability of exactly 4 calls in an hour, and what's the probability of no one calling in an hour? So using the formula, to calculate the probability of 4 arrivals in an hour, we put 4 into there, we put 5 in because 5 is the average that she's seen over time. Put 4 in the appropriate place and 1 in for the time period, and we calculate out to be 0.1755, or there's a 17.55% chance of having exactly 4 arrivals. Now, ask yourself this. If the probability of 4 arrivals is 17.5% and the mean number of arrivals is 5, what's the probability of having 0 arrivals? Is it going to be higher or lower than 17.5%? Well, if you follow your intuition, 0 is further away from 5 than 4 is, and as we discover, the probability of no one arriving in the hour is a little bit less than 1%, or 0.67%. Now Donald wants to know the probability of 3 or more calls in an hour. So in this case, we're going to use the arrivals worksheet to answer the question. This is a little bit different. She's not asking what's the probability of some exact number. She wants to know what's the probability of 3 or more. So let's go into the arrivals worksheet and play around a little bit. Now, before I answer the question that we have, I'm going to go back and confirm the spreadsheet works the way our formulas did. So I'm going to plug in what the average number of arrivals per time period is, 5. How many time periods are we looking at? 1 time period. What is the number of arrivals you are interested in? So we first did this for 4, and we got 17.5%. And we did it for no arrivals in an hour, and we got 0.67%. So it works the way we expect. Now, I want to emphasize the Poisson distribution is not at all like the normal distribution. So look right here. If the probability of exactly 4 arrivals in 1 time period is 17.5, what do you think the probability of 5 arrivals is? When we put in the spreadsheet, it turns out to be exactly the same as the probability of 4. And this goes against our intuition of the normal distribution, where the median and the mean lined up. Okay, so what was the question that was asked of us? The question is, what is the probability of 3 or more arrivals? So let me go back here and emphasize what I mean by that. The probability of 3 or more calls in an hour, I could add up the probability of 3 plus the probability of 4 plus the probability of 5 and keep on doing it. Or I could say it's 100%, which is all possible arrivals, minus the probability of no arrivals, minus the probability of 1 arrival, minus the probability of 2 arrivals. And what does that come out to be? Well, this is where we go back to our spreadsheet. The probability of no arrivals, I think we calculated that, was 0.67. So, go back here. It's 100% minus 0.67. The probability of 1 arrival is 3.37. And the probability of 2 arrivals is 8.42. So if we calculate that, that's going to be approximately, that's about 4% there. That's about 12.5% total. So there's probably going to be about an 87.5% probability of 3 or more arrivals. So take a second to make sure you understand the logic and how I use a spreadsheet to do that. And if you write your own notes out, do it with much better handwriting than me. I know it looks like I'm writing with my foot, but that's the best I can do. Let's talk about service rates. Just like arrival rates vary, service rates can vary as well. So you might hear someone say we can handle about 8 calls an hour on average. What they're really telling you then is that the average service rate is 8 calls per hour, and we're going to call that mu rather than lambda, which stands for the arrival rate, and that the average service time is 60 minutes divided by those 8 calls, or 7.5 minutes. And just as in the case of arrival rates, these service times can vary. And just as we used the negative exponential distribution to model the time between arrivals, we can also use the negative exponential distribution to model service times. So think about that one more time. I'll say it one more time. Just as we use the negative exponential distribution to model inter-arrival times, we use the negative exponential distribution to model service times. We use the Poisson distribution to model arrival rates. And I guess arguably, if you wanted to, you could use a Poisson distribution to model service rates. So if you're talking about rates, you're talking about Poisson. If you're talking about times, you're talking about the negative exponential distribution. Okay, so far we've talked about the essential features of waiting line systems. We've talked a lot about variability in arrival rates and service rates, and we showed how we could use a formula based on the Poisson distribution to assess the probability of a certain number of arrivals in a period of time given what the average arrival rate is. Now we're going to take it a step further and introduce some actual queuing models. And the queuing models, just like that formula we had earlier, are built on available statistics. And just as experts use probability distributions to describe arrival and service rates, they've developed formulas to evaluate the overall performance of actual queuing systems. So these are relatively more sophisticated models we're dealing with here. But before we get into actually applying some of these sets of formulas, we need to review some terminology and assumptions to ensure we use the right formulas. And the idea being is that there's different sets of formulas to model different queuing systems. So in terms of terminology, the first thing I want to do is make a distinction between units that are in the line waiting to be served or processed and those in the system. So in this particular case, I have 3 in the line, but 4 in the system. So when we look at our queuing formulas, we're going to talk about number in the line, number in the system, time spent waiting versus time in the system. In this particular case, I have what's called a single phase, single server system. And this is the easiest type of queuing system to deal with. I call it a single phase because I have one process step here that everyone goes through. If I had an additional step they had to go through, then I'd call it a multi-phase system. I also call it a single server phase because I have only one of these boxes. Now, if I had multiple boxes here and I had everyone has to go through one step, but they could go through it with either server 1, server 2, or server 3, I'd call that a multi-server system. And you can see that here. The first example here is a single line, single server, single phase system. Down here I still have a single line, but now I have multi-servers. Nonetheless, it's only a single phase. Everyone has to go through one step before they leave the process. Now, if you look in the real world, a lot of the environments we want to analyze are even more complex than that. What do we have here? Well, we have obviously multi-phases. Everyone has to go through this first step, and then they have to go through a second step. So we not only have multi-phases, but as you can see right here, we got multi-servers there, and we have multi-servers there. So we have a multi-line, multi-server, multi-phase system. Now, when we get the systems this complex, we typically have to pull out some simulation models, which is not a part of this particular lecture, but it's a topic we'll probably get around to by the end of this semester. Okay, so now that we've made a distinction between the line, the number in line, the number in the system, the difference between multiple servers and multiple phases, there's some other terminology and assumptions we have to understand. There's different models available for all sorts of queuing systems. There's a set of models depending on if you have an infinite or finite population. You know, imagine if you're in a situation where you only have 5 individuals who could enter the line. The formulas are going to be different because once you've got 5 in line, well, basically you're not going to have any more arrivals. You can have situations where you have infinite or fixed capacity, literally how many people can get into the system. If there's a limit on how many people can be in the system, then that's going to affect the formulas. We can have formulas depending on whether arrivals are random or constant. That is constant inter-arrival times, constant arrival rate, or whether the service rate is random or constant. The formulas we're going to look at, by the way, are going to assume that the inter-arrival times and the arrival rates are random, and the service times and service rates are random. Those different models based on different queue disciplines and whether the unit that's being worked on can either balk or abandon the system. So our job is to understand and pick the right model. So what I'm going to do here is show how we can use some queuing formulas to evaluate a very simple queuing system. And we're going to talk about the enrollment process at a small college. So you imagine people get hired at the college and they have to enroll for benefits, etc., payroll, using a single HR staff member. So you've got 15 enrollment requests per day on average coming in. That is, 15 people are joining the college every day and they want to enroll into the benefits system. So we have an arrival rate of 15 per day on average, which means the time between arrivals of these enrollment requests can vary. Furthermore, we have a service rate of 20 enrollment requests per day on average. And this represents how quickly the HR staff member could handle arrivals if he or she is busy all the time. Now, if you think about it, realistically, if they're only getting 15 enrollment requests per day, that's what their output's going to be. But there's a possibility that if they're kept busy all the time, they could do 20 per day. So if we look at this from a capacity perspective, it says, yeah, we got plenty of capacity here. So we shouldn't have any problems. We shouldn't have any queues develop. But you'd be wrong. Because of the variability in arrival and service rates, we can still have queues develop even when utilization is under 100%. So how many lines do we have here? How many servers? What is the queue discipline? Well, this is a very simple system. We have a single line, single server, single phase system, and the queue discipline is going to be first come, first serve. The questions we might have, in fact, is how long, on average, will an enrollment request wait to be worked on? How long will the enrollment request be in the system? We could also be interested, I guess, in the number of enrollment requests waiting and the number of enrollment requests in the system. Okay, so let's look at some of the formulas we can use to evaluate this. First of all, I'm going to define lambda as the arrival rate, and it's 15 requests per day. I'm going to define mu as the service rate, and it's 20 requests per day. For this particular type of system, the average number of requests being processed is described as rho, which is simply the ratio of the arrival rate to the service rate. And in fact, that turns out to be 15 over 20, which is equal to 0.75. So what that's telling me, on average, there's 0.75 enrollments being worked on. Does that make sense? Well, yeah, it kind of does, because if there was on average one request being processed and we have one server, that means they'd be busy 100% of the time. Another way to look at it here, in this particular simple system, rho also represents the utilization level for a single server system. So we could say that the average number of requests being processed is 0.75, or we could say the server is busy 75% of the time. They mean the same thing here. All right, so let's answer some more interesting questions. First of all, what is the average number of requests in the queue? Well, the formula for that, L sub q, which is our average number of requests in the queue, is rho times lambda divided by mu minus lambda. So if we were to work that out, it's going to be 0.75 times 15 divided by the difference between 20 minus 15, which is 5, and it comes out to be 2.25. So I would say 2.25 enrollment requests on average are in the queue waiting to be worked on. Now the next formula is a little bit different. This is the average number of requests in the system. So it turns out the average number of requests in the system is our arrival rate divided by our service rate minus the arrival rate, or 3 enrollments. Now, does this make intuitive sense? Well, if you think about it, L sub q is our average number waiting. So if we take the average number of waiting plus the average number being worked on, which was rho, that turns out to be 3. So, yep, it all makes sense. Okay, but again, these are enrollment requests. We're really not worried about how many of them are there because they don't take up a lot of space. In fact, they could be in email. We're more interested in how long it takes these enrollment requests to be done. So that sets up a different set of formulas. WQ represents the average time waiting. And we calculate that as rho 0.75 over the service rate minus the arrival rate. And this turns out to be 0.15. 0.15 watts. Well, if you think about what the units are, this is 0.75. This is 20 can be served per day, 15 arrive per day. So once you take care of what the units are, the average time waiting is 0.15 days. Now think about it this way: if you have submitted an enrollment request, what you want to know is when it's completed, not necessarily how long it waits before they start working, but how long it's going to take to be completed. So that is WS, which we simply take as 1 minus the service rate minus the arrival rate, which turns out to be 0.2 days. Now, obviously, where did these formulas come from? They were developed for us, so we're going to make use of them. If you want to see a derivation of where these formulas came from, I'll be glad to share it with you. But keep in mind, these are formulas that work only when we're describing a single line, single server, single phase system where the arrivals are random, i.e. they're following a negative exponential distribution in their arrival times, and the service times are random. So these are formulas that only work to describe this particular type of situation. Okay, another way to verify that the logic for this formula is good is if we think about it, another way of describing WS is going to be the waiting time plus whatever the time is it takes to process a particular enrollment request, which is 1/20th of a day. So we do the math. 0.15 plus 0.05 is indeed equal to 0.2 days. Okay, so that's pretty cool. This is a very simple system, but we've been able to analyze what the average performance of it is based on 2 parameters. And in fact, I set up a spreadsheet that lets us do that. In this particular case, if we say what the units are, what the time periods are, and what the arrival rates and service rates are, it'll generate the results for us. So let's go back and verify that we can do that. And I go to the queuing spreadsheet. So we're talking about enrollments here, not calls. Help if I could spell it. There we are. 2 L's. Thank you. Days. We got 15 enrollments coming in each day. We can handle up to 20. And in fact, you can confirm that the results of the spreadsheet match up what we did by hand. So I got a question for you. Suppose during the peak enrollment period, let's say before the start of the school year, the arrival rate reaches 18 requests per day. Let's recalculate the average number waiting, average number in the system, average time in waiting, average time in the system with that high arrival rate. Before we do that, what do you think the utilization level is going to be? Well, it'll be 18 requests per day over a service rate of 20, so the utilization rate will grow to 90%. So if we didn't know any better, we'd say, well, great, we're still not being utilized 100%. But let's actually watch what happens when we do this in the formulas. If we grow the arrival rate to 18, all of a sudden, the average number waiting, average number in the system, and the time numbers jump dramatically. In fact, average time in the system grows from 0.2 days to 0.5 days. Now that may not be a problem, but what about this? What if the arrival rate gets to 19? Now we got 1 day in the system. What if the arrival rate goes to 19.5? It's still under the service rate of 20, so technically we're not going to be utilized 100% of the time, but you start seeing the numbers increase dramatically. Here is the big aha I want you to take away from this. In waiting line systems where we have variability in arrival and service rates, we cannot utilize the system capacity at 100%. If we do, performance can degrade very quickly. In fact, what we see here is once we get past, roughly 90% utilization in a case like this, we start going to 90% utilization here would be 18 over 20. Once we start getting much past that, the performance starts degrading very quickly. So service managers have to be cognizant of that when they have randomness in arrivals and service times. You would never try to keep a service utilized at 95% due to the potential for extraordinarily long wait times if these numbers vary slightly. Look at this. Suppose for a second that the arrival rate's 19.5 and our service rate falls just slightly to 19.8. Look what happens down here to the time in the system when I hit enter. Bang, makes a huge difference. So slight variances make a big difference when we're running a system near capacity. Don't do it. I'll be glad to talk to you at length about how you determine what's the appropriate utilization level that you want to run your capacity at in a service process environment. Okay. And so we went through, we showed that at 18 enrollments coming in per day on average and a service rate of 20, that we saw a significant increase in numbers in the system, number waiting, and time waiting and time in the system. So I have some additional questions. Suppose the enrollment manager is still struggling with an arrival rate of 18 enrollments per day, but here's the problem. The manager has learned that the new, more detailed enrollment forms that they're going to have to do this year are taking longer to process. In fact, the new service rate is 9.1 requests per day for a single staff member. So if we go back to our spreadsheet for a second and we put an arrival rate of 18 and a service rate of 9.1 per day, we find out that the formulas blow up. That's just that's not a fancy way, but it's a way of saying that now we're in a situation where the arrivals coming into the system are faster than our processing time. In effect, we're out of steady state and the queues will continue to grow. So we can't talk about average waiting times or average times in the system anymore. This system's not in steady state anymore. It can't reach steady state. At least not with one server. So the manager knows she's going to have to assign additional staff members, but how many? Requests would queue in a single line and then be handled by the first available staff member. So what we're talking about here is a single line, single phase, multi-server system. But the question is, do we need 2 staff members? Do we need 3? Do we need 4? I don't know. So to answer those questions, I'm going to use the single line multi-server worksheet that I gave to you. And that worksheet looks something like this. So let me go to the active spreadsheet. I picked the single line multi-server spreadsheet. The arrival rate's 18. And the service rate is 9.1 per time period per server. So I just want to point out a couple things. Ignore the numbers for a second here. But the spreadsheet I have here is queuing model formulas for a simple single line, multiple server queuing system with random arrivals and service times. So this is a very specific set of formulas for that type of system. Now, a couple important notes. The formulas are only valid if the cumulative service rate exceeds the arrival rate. What does that mean? Well, that simply means we have to take the number of servers times the service rate, and that has to be greater than the arrival rate for the numbers to be valid. So if we have just one server, 1 times 9.1 is not greater than 18. But 2 times 9.1 is 18.2, and it is greater than 18. So the first thing we notice is here, if the number of servers is 1, that is the original system we had, then the formulas are invalid. It just can never reach steady state. We can never talk about the average number of customers in the system or the average number in line or the average time in the system. But once we have 2 servers, we can reach steady state because in theory the service rate, the cumulative service rate, is greater than the arrival rate. But what happens here? Well, if we have a combined service rate of 18.2 and we have 18 arrivals coming in per day, what do we see? Average number of customers in the system is 90.497. In this case, those are applications. Average number of customers in line is 88.5. The more relevant numbers are average time in line is 4.92 days. Average time in the system is 5.03 days. So technically, we could do it with 2 servers, 2 people handling the enrollments, but the times are going to be extraordinarily long. Now here's what's interesting. What happens when we add a 3rd server? Makes a tremendous difference. The average number of customers in the system, average number of enrollment requests, that is, falls from 90.5 to 2.8. More importantly, the average time in the system falls from 5 days to 0.16 days. So let's put on our manager's hat. First of all, do we need more than 3 servers? No. That performance looks great. In fact, adding 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 servers isn't going to really make much difference in performance. We've got pretty much all the benefit we need with 3. So my question to you, do we want 2 or 3 servers or something else? So think about that for a few seconds. Well, if you're clever enough, what you might say is 2 servers isn't enough, but 3 servers might arguably be too much. So maybe we take a person and have them work half-time on the enrollment request. So we have 2 full-time people and half a person working on it. So we kind of split the baby there. And I don't have a formula to model that, but you could see how we would probably get some result between 5 and 0.16 days, which would be acceptable. Okay. Last point I want to make in the spreadsheet is if we put in the same conditions we had at the very start when we talked about a single server system, single phase with arrivals of 15 per day and a service rate of 20, if you look at the results for 1 server, we get pretty much what the other formulas told us before. They're the same effective formulas. Average number in the system was 3, average number in the line was 2.25, average time in the system was 0.2 days, and the probability of 0 customers in the system was 25%. And for a single server, that's the flip side of saying the utilization is 75%. Okay, so take some time, work through the spreadsheets, play with them, see what happens as the arrival rate approaches the service rates, especially for a single server system. What you'll notice is that performance gets bad incredibly fast, exponentially, as the arrival rates approach the service rates. Okay, let's do a practice problem. Let's suppose we're looking at a sheriff's office, and on average 4 quote-unquote customers per hour need to use the public telephone in the detention area. And the time between calls is randomly distributed. That is, the inter-arrival time follows a negative exponential distribution. Furthermore, let's assume that the length of the phone call varies according to a negative exponential distribution, which is a fancy way of saying this, the service rate varies, and that the average service time is 5 minutes. So the sheriff will install a second phone when a customer can expect to wait 3 minutes or longer for the phone. Okay? So the question is, first of all, is how long would we expect on average for someone to wait to use the phone, and how much higher would the arrival rate have to get to make that wait time 3 minutes or longer? So before we go any further, I want to point out, to make this problem work, we have to be able to estimate the arrival rate and the service rate. So what's the arrival rate? Well, that's easy. They tell us 4 per hour. All right. What's the service rate? If you say 5, you're wrong. 5 is the average service time. To find the service rate, you have to take 60 minutes, divide by the average service time, which comes out to be 12 per hour. So make sure you don't make that mistake. Now, I look at this and I'm saying, okay, the sheriff will install a second phone when a customer can expect to wait 3 minutes or longer. So I know I'm going to be using the spreadsheet where I can look at the multi-server option. So I go back to my handy dandy spreadsheet. I look at an arrival rate to start of 4, and I look at a service rate of 12. Well, first of all, if we've got one phone, we're looking at the results here. If we have one phone, it'll be busy roughly 33% of the time. Average number of customers in the system will be 0.5. Average number of customers in line will be 0.167. Average time in the system will be 0.13. And the average time in line will be 0.04. Well, that's in terms of hours. So we've got to ask ourselves, how do we interpret that in terms of minutes? Well, what does 0.04 hours turn out to be? I go back here to do a little bit of drawing for a second. It turns out that 0.04 hours, I have to multiply it by 60 minutes, turns out to be 2.4 minutes, which is below the cutoff wait time of 3 minutes. In fact, 3 minutes is the equivalent of 0.05 hours. Okay. Okay, what I've done here is I've actually added a few more decimal places in this column so I can see when the average time in line approaches 0.05. So when we have 4 arrivals per time period, we're okay. At 4.1, average time in line starts to come up. You can see it here. But we're still okay. If the arrival rate is 4.2 arrivals per time period, we're still okay. I'm going to keep on creeping up here. Now obviously we could do this using algebra and the formulas, but I'm just making use of the spreadsheet. Okay, my spreadsheet tells me when the average arrival rate gets up to 4.5 arrivals per time period, average time in the line will be 0.05 hours or 3 minutes. Now, just so we're clear, remember, the actual number of arrivals in a time period has to be a whole number, right? We can have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 arrivals. But the average itself can be a fractional value. So don't confuse the fact that the Poisson distribution describes arrival rates with the fact that you can actually have an average arrival rate that is fractional. And that's what we have here. So the answer to the question is when we start getting on average 4.5 people per hour wanting to use the phone, we need to install a second phone. So let's try another practice problem. Now, after I've described the problem, I'd like you to work on it on your own and see if you can't come up with the answers before we go through them. So you're probably going to take about 20 minutes or so to come up with the answer to the entire problem. Suppose we have a local bank and they're concerned about the level of service at its single ATM machine. A study of the customer arrivals during the busy period revealed that on average 20 customers were arriving per hour. So that means an average inter-arrival time of 3 minutes. The average service time is 2 minutes following a negative exponential distribution. So the first question I have is, what is the expected number of customers waiting for the current system where you have a single ATM? And after you've answered that question, the bank is considering adding ATMs. And if you add ATMs, you can think about it, people are going to have to wait less. So the question is it worth adding additional ATMs? So to do that, we have to put a cost on capacity versus the cost in terms of waiting. In other words, as we add ATMs, the cost of waiting should go down, but the cost of ATMs will increase. So the bank is considering adding these ATMs. They figured out that the hourly cost of each ATM is $20. The bank has also decided that the cost of making a customer wait, which is ill will, lost future business, etc., can be approximated at $40 per hour. Now we're going to come back and talk about waiting cost in more detail in a moment, but think about it this way. Customer waiting cost is almost like inventory holding cost. So the idea being, if you hold inventory in a factory, there's some cost associated with that, usually cost of capital, opportunity cost. If you hold a customer in the system, however, and make them wait, then the cost is going to be, they're going to become dissatisfied, they may take their business elsewhere, etc. So there is some ramification for keeping them in line, especially for long periods of time. So with these estimates of the cost of each ATM per hour and the cost of making a customer wait being approximated $40 per hour, the question becomes how many ATMs do we need? Furthermore, suppose the average arrival rate has now increased to 25 per hour versus what it was at the beginning of the problem. Okay, so take a few minutes to look at that, and then we'll come back and we'll solve it. Okay, the first part of the problem asks for the expected number of customers waiting, where we have a situation where the arrival rate is 20 per hour and the service rate is 30 per hour. And I get that because the average service time is 2 minutes. So I go to my handy dandy spreadsheet, and I can do this in the queuing model formulas for a simple single line with one or more servers. So I put in an arrival rate of 20 per hour, and I put in a service rate of 30 per hour. Okay, so if I look at the results for one server, and the question again was, what is the expected number of customers waiting? So if I go back to my spreadsheet, average number of customers in line is 1.33. And so that's the answer to that question. I could have done that by hand using the formulas. So if you want to play with that a little bit, you can. The second question says, basically, how many ATMs should we have if the hourly cost of each ATM is $20, the cost of making a customer wait for 1 hour is $40, and the arrival rate has reached 25 per hour. So this is a little bit tougher to structure. We have to think about hourly cost if we have 1 ATM, 2 ATM, 3 ATM, etc. So the first thing I'm going to do is go back to the spreadsheet and now adjust it for an arrival rate of 25 arrivals per time period. Okay? So let's think about this in terms of the current system where we have 1 ATM. So if we have 1 ATM, how would we define the cost? This is how I'm going to do it. If I have 1 ATM, then my hourly cost consists of 2 basic pieces. The ATM cost per hour and the waiting cost per hour. The first one's easy. They told us 1 ATM would cost us $20 per hour. So that's going to be $20 right here. But we have to add that to the waiting cost. So what is the waiting cost going to be? Well, think about this in terms of inventory holding costs, because that's really what we're dealing with here. So one thing we may say is, well, we'll take the average number of customers waiting, and we'll multiply that by the estimated holding cost of $40 per hour. So what does that come out to be? Well, it comes out to be $20 on this side. And if we look at our spreadsheet, the average number of customers waiting when we have 1 ATM turns out to be, average number of customers in line, 4.167. So I go back here, 4.167 times $40. And that all comes out to be about $20 plus, I think about $167. So about $187. So the question becomes, is 2 ATMs cheaper? So take a second and see if you can't figure out how we're going to do it for 2 ATMs. Okay? If we have 2 ATMs, then the costs of the ATMs themselves are $40. The waiting cost is going to be $40 per customer, but the average number of customers is going to go down. It's 4.167 when we have 1 ATM, but it goes down to 0.175 when we have 2 ATMs. So we have a dramatic decrease in the size of the queue. And in fact, this comes out to be $40. I apologize again for my penmanship here. Plus about $7 for the waiting cost, for a total of $47. So I want to stop here for a second. Think what we've done here. We bump into this kind of business problem all the time. Should we add capacity to the process? If we do, what's the benefit? What are the costs? We have actually used queuing theory here. We've used a rational approach to determine whether we should add capacity or not. In this particular case, 2 ATMs will lower the cost of $47. Now we can have a debate whether $40 is an accurate, the $40 we use is an accurate representation of the waiting cost, but if we feel that's an appropriate estimate of the waiting cost for a customer, then it's saying get 2 ATMs. It makes a lot of sense. It lowers the waiting times substantially for only an additional $20 per hour for the second ATM. Now, got a third question for you. Do we even need to consider 3 ATMs? And I'm going to argue we don't even have to look at it. Because think about it this way. What if 3 ATMs was to drive waiting times down to 0? So in effect we had no one in the system. That is, this would come down to 0. Well, if we drive all the customers out of the system, so there's literally no waiting, then the waiting costs will drop to 0, but now we'll have $60 worth of ATM costs. So we've reached the point that it doesn't make sense to have any additional ATMs given the cost balance between the cost of the ATMs and the waiting cost. So this is a relatively complex problem, but it really illustrates beautifully how we can use theory and rational analysis to look at a process capacity decision. Again, take a few minutes to make sure you understand my logic here. Okay, let's end this lecture with a discussion about the economics and psychology of waiting. This is particularly relevant when we have people in the system. I just talked about the notion of inventory holding cost, and that's usually applied to items, but it can also apply to people as well. So I want to talk about what the costs of waiting are and what we can do to lower those costs, or at least the perceived cost. So think about it this way. As the time spent waiting increases, what is the waiting cost from a customer's perspective? So what goes into determining waiting costs for a customer, and how will these costs change as waiting time increases? Well, obviously, one of the things that goes into determining waiting costs for the customers are opportunity costs to do something else. So if you're talking about a doctor, for instance, waiting on the phone to talk to the pharmacy versus an individual customer, they're going to have differential cost. Furthermore, as time increases, the waiting costs are going to increase arguably exponentially, non-linearly, because of dissatisfaction. Think about it this way. If you call up a business and you have to wait 20 seconds to talk to someone, that's okay. If you have to wait 40 seconds, you start getting a little irritated. 2 minutes, you're much, much more irritated. 5 minutes, you're about ready to explode. The costs have not gone up linearly. So that's why we usually argue that as time spent waiting increases, the waiting costs go up non-linearly. They accelerate due to the psychological factors. After you've been on the phone for 4 minutes, every second is torture. And now again, how would I estimate these costs? Well, that is the million-dollar question. And it may involve some marketing research to figure out how long people are willing to wait before they hang up, before they start talking badly about the business. A lot of things that could go into that depending on the situation. It's not an easy question to answer. What most companies do is if they are concerned about the cost of waiting either from a service side or manufacturing side, they tend to use a fairly high estimate of those waiting costs just to keep the issue in the forefront. Okay, the other question is service cost. If waiting costs are nonlinear, then we have to think about what the cost is of trying to add capacity to bring down those waiting times. And what I'm trying to show here is that those service costs are exponential. So imagine this, like in the case of the bank we just talked about. We had one ATM. When we added a second ATM, we brought the time spent waiting down dramatically. We had an incredible savings in waiting costs, but all we had to do was double our service cost. Now, if we add a third ATM, it's not going to have much of an impact on the waiting cost. We add a fourth, a fifth, they're not going to have much impact as well. So generally speaking, when you have variability in arrival rates and variability in service rates, trying to bring the time spent down waiting to zero would require excessive amounts of capacity. Now, those of you who've had a basic economics course ought to be thinking, I have two cost curves that are crossing. And yep, if you think about it that way, if we have two cost curves that are crossing, then we can think about some minimum cost point that strikes the best balance between service cost and waiting cost. Now, what we might also think about doing is instead of just worrying about balancing the cost given the current cost curves, we might actually think about bending or shifting those curves. For instance, what have I done here? I've shifted the waiting cost curve. And what does that mean? Well, that means for a given amount of time in the system, the waiting cost is less. And that especially applies if we're talking about people. So how can waiting cost decrease for the same amount of time? Well, I could be waiting in a more pleasant environment. Maybe I have a TV, I have magazines to read, etc. Maybe if I have someone on the phone, I'm giving them useful information while they're on the phone, rather than just an advertisement or bad music. So we can shift that waiting cost curve over time. So all things being equal, we lower the total cost associated with waiting. And this is an example, again, of how we can shift the waiting cost curve. We can add value during the wait time. We can divide the wait time up, let the customer get their foot in the door, and let them be doing some things. Give you an example. When I was younger as a kid, you used to wait in the doctor's office lobby until the doctor wanted to see you. Then you went into there. Now what they do is they almost, as soon as they can, put you in a room, have you undress, quote unquote, stage you as inventory for the doctor to work on you. But once you get in that room and you're undressed and you're wearing that napkin on you, you say, hey, I'm in the system. Other things you can do to shift the waiting cost curve is acknowledge and update the customers. You can also segment the customers. That is, take key customers with very high waiting costs and handle them first. Now we can also shift the service cost curve. And what does that mean and how do we do it? So if we can shift the waiting cost curve to the right and shift the service cost curve to the left, in effect we can lower the total cost of waiting. Some of the ways we can do this is through automation. We can offload certain tasks to the customer, depending on the service environment we're in. We can also segment customers or jobs to better match the needs with expensive capacity. Ideal example. Think about experienced personnel. They cost the most per hour to have, so maybe we save them for the most difficult cases. So to summarize, this is a fairly big lecture with some quantitative stuff in it, but here's the key points to take away. If we're in a business process environment where arrival rates and or service rates vary, Queues are going to form even when the average service rates exceed average arrival rates. And because of that, in waiting line environments, managers must consider the relationship between capacity levels, utilization levels, and key performance metrics like time in line, line length, etc. In fact, you may have a customer that says average waiting time must be no greater than this, and that's going to drive your capacity decisions. But the point is, if you think you're going to be in a waiting line environment and utilize your resources at 95% on average and be successful, that's simply not the case. You're going to have to consider the impact of the variability. And some queuing theory provides us with some tools to analyze relatively simple systems. Now, this is a quick introduction to queuing theory. If you took a simulation class or a more detailed statistics class, you could do a lot more than this, but I just wanted to get the topic out there and get you thinking about this. In fact, the tools we've talked about are fairly powerful for a lot of pretty simple business environments.